When Hollywood loses a legend, the world doesn't just grieve, it stops. Robert Redford wasn't just another actor, he was a symbol. A man whose face and voice defined generations of cinema. From Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid to The Sting, from All the President's Men to his work as a director and producer, Redford's career stretched across decades, reshaping the industry with every role he touched. So when the news of his passing broke, millions of fans were left in shock. It wasn't just that we lost a movie star. We lost a storyteller, a trailblazer, and someone who helped shape the golden age of Hollywood. But what happened next was something no one expected. As the world prepared to say goodbye, a funeral was arranged that became a gathering unlike any other. Stars from every corner of Hollywood came together to honor him. Yet in the middle of the tears, the speeches, and the heartfelt tributes, there was one moment that stood above them all. A moment that froze the room and left even the most hardened Hollywood veterans speechless. And it came from his daughter, Amy Redford. The announcement of Robert Redford's passing sent shockwaves through every corner of the world. Fans who grew up watching his films felt as though a piece of their childhood had disappeared overnight. News outlets ran tributes, social media flooded with clips of his most iconic moments, and fellow actors shared stories that revealed not just the artist, but the man behind the camera. For many, Redford represented something bigger than Hollywood itself. He was an artist who never allowed himself to be boxed in. He refused to play just one kind of role, moving from charming outlaw to whistleblower, from romantic lead to complex anti-hero. And beyond the big screen, he built Sundance into more than just a film festival. He built it into a movement, a platform for independent voices, for young filmmakers who never would have had a chance without his vision. But what made his passing so difficult for fans and colleagues wasn't just his career. It was the fact that Redford had always seemed timeless. Even in his later years, he carried himself with the same quiet strength, the same piercing look, the same charisma that once made him Hollywood's brightest star. To many, it felt impossible to imagine a world without him in it. And so, when the day of his funeral came, it wasn't just another Hollywood event. It was something deeper, a moment where an industry, a family, and millions of fans all came together to face the reality of saying goodbye. But as emotional as that moment was, what happened inside the funeral hall went far beyond what anyone expected. And that's where the story takes a turn. Because this wasn't just a funeral, it was a gathering of legends. From the moment the service began, it was clear this wasn't going to be an ordinary farewell. The chapel was filled with a sea of faces, not just family and close friends, but some of the most recognizable names in Hollywood history. Actors and directors from every generation came together, many of whom owed their careers to Redford in one way or another. You could see Paul Newman's family sitting near the front, a reminder of Redford's iconic partnership in Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. Across the aisle were younger stars, actors who weren't even born when Redford made his most legendary films, but who credited him as their inspiration to pursue acting in the first place. From veteran directors who shared decades of memories with him to fresh faces who grew up idolizing his work, the room was a rare mix of Hollywood's past, present, and future. Everywhere you looked, people were sharing quiet embraces, whispering stories, and holding back tears. Some brought flowers, others brought handwritten notes, and still others simply sat in silence, unable to put their emotions into words. What united them all was the shared recognition that they weren't just honoring an actor. They were honoring a man who had given Hollywood some of its greatest stories and had shaped countless lives in the process. As the tributes began, colleagues stepped forward to share memories. Directors recalled late nights working with Redford on set, praising his tireless dedication to the craft. Actors spoke of how he encouraged them when they doubted themselves, always insisting that art came first, fame second. Some of his closest friends revealed the private Redford, the man who preferred quiet moments outdoors, who loved the mountains and rivers more than the spotlight. It was a ceremony filled with raw emotion and deep respect. And yet, even in a room full of stars, all eyes kept drifting toward the family in the front row. Because while the industry had lost a giant, they had lost a father, a grandfather, and a friend. And when his daughter Amy finally rose to give her tribute, everything changed. While Hollywood's elite filled the room with memories and admiration, there was a different kind of silence when the focus turned to Redford's family. For them, this wasn't just about losing an icon. This was about losing the man who sat at the dinner table, who gave fatherly advice, who quietly supported them long before the cameras ever turned on. Sitting in the front row were his children, each carrying their grief in their own way. Some held hands tightly, others kept their eyes closed as if holding on to the sound of his voice in their memory. His grandchildren sat close, trying to stay strong, though many in the crowd could see their tears. The family's presence made the service feel heavier. Every story told by Hollywood friends carried an extra layer of meaning, because behind the tales of fame and artistry, there was the reminder that Robert Redford was first and foremost a father and grandfather. The industry might remember the superstar, but his family remembered the man who told bedtime stories, who built traditions, who stood by them during their hardest moments. One by one, family members were invited to share their reflections. Some spoke briefly, thanking the crowd for honoring their father with such love. Others quietly declined, unable to bring themselves to speak through the pain. But throughout it all, everyone knew there was one voice they were waiting for, one that carried a special weight. Because while all of Robert's children shared a bond with him, Amy Redford was the one who followed him most closely into the world of storytelling. She became an actress and director in her own right, carrying on the legacy he built, but also forging her own identity. And so when she finally rose from her seat, the entire room fell into complete silence. People leaned forward. Even the stars, people who had seen everything Hollywood had to offer, found themselves waiting, almost holding their breath. This was the moment everyone would remember, the moment that would define the service. And as Amy stepped toward the podium, her face calm but her hands trembling slightly, the entire chapel seemed to freeze in time. There are moments in life where silence speaks louder than words, and this was one of them. As Amy walked slowly to the front, the audience didn't move. No whispers, no shuffling, no sound at all. Only the soft echo of her footsteps filled the room. When she reached the podium, she paused. For a moment, it looked as if she might not be able to speak. She closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and when she opened them again, the weight of her father's legacy seemed to rest on her shoulders. She began softly, her voice steady but low. She didn't talk about his movies or his fame. She didn't list his awards or his career highlights. Instead, she spoke of her father, the man who taught her to be curious about the world, who encouraged her to listen before speaking, and who showed her that real strength often came in moments of vulnerability. Her words weren't polished like a Hollywood speech. They were raw, personal, and filled with the kind of honesty that can only come from family. She spoke of the quiet mornings they shared when she was a child, of hiking trips where he would point out the smallest details in nature, teaching her to see beauty where others might not. She recalled how he always reminded her that success wasn't about fame, but about truth, about telling stories that mattered. As Amy's voice trembled, many in the audience began to cry. Some held their heads down, others wiped their eyes openly. The emotional weight in the room was overwhelming. But Amy wasn't done. Her tone grew stronger as she spoke of his resilience, how even in his later years, when the world expected him to slow down, he refused to stop pushing forward. She described him as a man who believed that no matter how much success you achieved, you should always remain a student of life. Every sentence she delivered cut through the room with piercing clarity. People weren't just hearing a daughter talk about her father. They were hearing the kind of truth that transcends fame and fortune. And then, with a long pause, she leaned closer to the microphone and said something that made the entire chapel fall into stunned silence. Because what she revealed next wasn't just about Robert Redford the actor, or even Robert Redford the father. It was about the man few ever truly knew, and the words she spoke would change the way everyone remembered him. The moment Amy Redford began to speak with strength in her voice, the entire chapel leaned in. Her words were not rehearsed, not polished like a Hollywood script. They were real, and that raw authenticity is what made her tribute unforgettable. She started by painting a picture of her childhood with her father. She described how, even with the demands of fame, he never let the world of Hollywood consume their family time. She told a story of how he would come home from set, exhausted from a long day of filming, but still insist on sitting down with her to talk, to listen, to make sure she knew she mattered. He wasn't Robert Redford the actor in those moments. He was just Dad. Amy's voice cracked when she recalled the nights they spent under the stars, sitting quietly on family camping trips. She spoke of how he would point out constellations and remind her that in the grand scale of the universe, fame and fortune meant nothing. What mattered was kindness, honesty, and the love you leave behind. The room grew heavier with emotion as she shared how those lessons shaped her own path in life. She admitted that being the daughter of such a towering figure was never easy. Expectations followed her everywhere, but her father never pressured her to be him. Instead, he encouraged her to be herself, to find her own voice, and to create her own stories. And then she revealed something deeply personal, that whenever she doubted herself, he would whisper a simple phrase that carried her through every struggle: "Your story matters." It wasn't just encouragement, it was his philosophy of life, passed down to her. By now, many in the crowd were openly crying. Colleagues who had spent decades working alongside Redford sat with tears running down their cheeks. Younger actors bowed their heads in respect, recognizing that they weren't just hearing about a legendary career, they were witnessing the intimate legacy of a father and daughter. Amy closed this part of her tribute with a statement that left chills in the room. "My father's greatest role," she said, "wasn't the ones you watched on screen. It was the one he played when the cameras weren't rolling. It was being my dad." Her words hung in the air like a soft echo. And though the room was filled with some of the most powerful names in the industry, in that moment, there was no Hollywood. There was only family, grief, and love. But just when the audience thought her tribute had reached its emotional peak, Amy went deeper, went away. After a long pause, Amy looked around the room, her eyes searching for strength. And then she began sharing stories that few outside the family had ever heard. She spoke of the man behind the myth, not the Hollywood star, but the quiet human being who struggled, doubted, and carried burdens he rarely revealed. She admitted that her father, despite his legendary status, often questioned whether he had done enough, whether his art truly made a difference. He would confess those fears late at night, away from the public eye, when it was just family. The crowd shifted uneasily. To hear Robert Redford, a man who seemed larger than life, described as vulnerable was almost unthinkable. Yet it was this honesty that made Amy's words so powerful. She shared that there were times he considered walking away from Hollywood entirely. The pressures, the constant spotlight, it wore on him. But what what kept him going wasn't the fame. It was his belief in stories, in truth, and in giving a platform to those who might otherwise be silenced. That was why Sundance wasn't just an idea to him. It was his way of fighting for the art he believed in. Then came the most emotional confession of all. Amy revealed that her father once told her that his proudest moments weren't the awards or the box office numbers. It was seeing her step into her own creative path. He told her he saw in her the courage he sometimes lacked, and that her willingness to take risks reminded him why he fell in love with storytelling in the first place. By the time Amy shared this, the room was silent again, but not with anticipation, with awe. People weren't just mourning a Hollywood icon anymore. They were mourning a man who carried doubts, who faced struggles, who leaned on his family for strength. Her final words in this section were almost a whisper. "My father always told me that we don't own our stories. We just carry them for a little while. And today, I carry his." The weight of her voice lingered in the room long after she stepped back from the microphone. For many, it was the first time they felt they had truly met Robert Redford. Not through a screen, but through the eyes of his daughter. And as Amy returned to her seat, the reaction from the crowd said everything. When Amy returned to her seat, there was a hush over the room unlike anything Hollywood had ever experienced. This was not the silence of shock, nor the polite quiet of ceremony. This was something deeper, a silence born from being profoundly moved. Directors who had spent their entire careers working with legends sat with tears streaming down their faces. Actors who had once been hailed as unshakable icons covered their mouths, overwhelmed by the raw honesty they had just heard. Even the younger generation, stars who were more accustomed to social media tributes than intimate stories, sat transfixed, realizing they had just witnessed a moment they would carry with them forever. Some in the audience bowed their heads in prayer. Others reached for the hands of those sitting beside them. And when the silence finally broke, it wasn't with applause. It was with a sound of muffled sobs, soft weeping that spread like a wave across the chapel. A few stepped forward afterward to share their own tributes. Colleagues spoke about the way Redford shaped their craft. Younger actors admitted that his words of encouragement were the reason they never gave up on their dreams. One director told a story of how Robert, even at the peak of his fame, would pause filming to check in on crew members, making sure no one felt overlooked. But Amy's words lingered above everything else. People referenced her tribute in their own remarks, echoing her phrase, "Your story matters," as if it had already become a mantra. Those three words seemed to hang in the air long after she had sat down, almost as though Robert himself had spoken them one final time through her. By the end of the ceremony, people weren't just leaving with memories of Robert Redford's films. They were leaving with a new understanding of the man, and with a deeper respect for the family who carried his legacy forward. And yet, as powerful as that moment was, it wasn't the end of the story. Because Robert Redford's legacy didn't end in that chapel. It was only beginning. Long after the service ended, conversations about Robert Redford's life continued across the world. News outlets replayed Amy's tribute, quoting her words about kindness, honesty, and the importance of carrying stories. Fans flooded social media, not just with clips of his films, but with reflections on how his work had inspired them personally. In Hollywood, the funeral sparked something bigger. Younger filmmakers began sharing how Sundance had given them their very first chance, opportunities they never would have had if not for Robert's vision. Veteran actors spoke of how he quietly mentored them, shaping their careers behind the scenes. Directors recalled how he fought for creative freedom, often risking his own reputation to ensure the integrity of a film. But beyond the industry, it was Amy's tribute that became the centerpiece of his legacy. Her words reminded people that behind every icon is a human being, one who doubts, one who struggles, one who loves deeply. She had given the world a rare gift, a glimpse into the side of Robert Redford that few had ever known. And in doing so, she immortalized him not just as a Hollywood legend, but as a father whose lessons would echo long after his passing. Her phrase, "Your story matters," spread like wildfire, becoming a reminder that every life holds value, every voice deserves to be heard, and every story carries meaning. Even after passing, Robert Redford continued to inspire, not through the glamour of red carpets or the bright lights of movie premieres, but through the quiet wisdom passed down to his daughter, and through her to the world. And as people left that chapel, they weren't just mourning an actor, they were carrying forward a legacy that would never fade. Robert Redford's funeral was not just the farewell of a movie star, it was the celebration of a man who shaped generations, who built an empire of stories, and who lived a life dedicated to truth and art. Hollywood may have filled the room that day, but it was Amy Redford's words that carved themselves into history. Her tribute was more than stunning. It was transformative. It reminded everyone listening that Robert Redford's greatest role wasn't captured on screen, but lived out every day as a father, a mentor, and a believer in the power of stories. And perhaps that's the thought we are left with. What will we remember most about Robert Redford? The legendary performances, the awards, the festival that bore his name? Or will it be something far more personal? The quiet words of a daughter who revealed the heart of a man the world thought it already knew. Because in the end, Robert Redford's legacy isn't just in Hollywood. It's in every person who tells their story because he reminded them that it matters. And that is a tribute that will never be forgotten.
I saw her on a TV show, and I had never seen her before, and I said, "That's it." I said, whoever she is, I'm going to go with it. I'm going to take a chance.
What happens when one of Hollywood's most untouchable legends makes a final wish no one saw coming? Robert Redford was more than just an actor. He was a symbol of rebellion, of independence, of the kind of artistry that refuses to be boxed in. For decades, he dominated the silver screen, stepping into roles that defined entire eras. From the playful outlaw in Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid to the stern, Oscar-winning director of Ordinary People, his career was nothing short of extraordinary. But here's the twist. When his health began to decline, Redford didn't quietly retreat into the shadows of fame like so many others before him. Instead, he asked for something so raw and personal that it stunned even those who knew him best. His family, caught between heartbreak and duty, suddenly found themselves at the center of a mission that would shape how the world remembered him. And at the heart of it all was Amy Redford, his daughter, the quietest member of the family in the public eye, but the one who would soon carry the heaviest weight of all. Because this wasn't about money, awards, or press. This was about legacy, about how a man who had spent his life rewriting Hollywood would now decide how he wanted to be remembered when he's gone. Before we reveal what that final wish was, you have to understand the legend behind the name, because only then does the weight of his request truly sink in. Robert Redford wasn't born into Hollywood. He fought his way into it. A kid from Santa Monica who bounced through odd jobs, setbacks, and rejections before ever seeing his name on a marquee. When he finally did break through, it wasn't as a one-dimensional pretty face. It was as a performer who carried an almost magnetic defiance, a refusal to be ordinary. The world met this energy head-on in Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid alongside Paul Newman. That film wasn't just a box office hit, it was the kind of cultural explosion that rewired what audiences expected from heroes. Suddenly, the outlaw wasn't just a villain or a joke, he was charismatic, flawed, human. Redford turned that archetype upside down, and Hollywood never looked back. But he didn't stop there. Movies like The Sting and All the President's Men cemented him not only as a leading man, but as a voice of the times. When he directed Ordinary People and it swept the Oscars, critics finally had to admit what fans already knew. Redford wasn't just another actor. He was a force, reshaping the very industry around him. And then came Sundance. Not the film, but the institute, the festival, the movement. While most stars built mansions and measured their careers in dollar signs, Redford invested in the future of storytelling. He opened doors for filmmakers who never would have had a chance otherwise. Scrappy voices, diverse perspectives, bold ideas. He wasn't content to sit back and enjoy his own success. He wanted to change the system. By the time he reached the later stages of his career, Robert Redford was untouchable. He had nothing left to prove. To Hollywood, he was a legend. To his fans, a hero. And to his family, he was still just Dad. But even the brightest stars can't outrun time. And while Redford never stopped reinventing himself on screen, off-screen he was facing something he couldn't simply outact. Something far more human, far more devastating. Behind closed doors, Robert Redford was fighting a war most of the world didn't know about: Parkinson's disease. The illness had slowly, cruelly chipped away at the body of a man once defined by strength, charisma, and unshakable presence. To fans, Redford still appeared sharp, composed, and dignified in public. But at home, in the quiet of his Utah estate, the cracks were visible. His movements slowed. His once powerful hands trembled. His voice, which had once commanded entire theaters, now sometimes fell to a whisper. And yet, his spirit never dimmed. Those closest to him recall how he could still launch into stories about his early struggles, about Hollywood manipulation, about the friendships and rivalries that had shaped his life. Amy, his daughter, became the one who witnessed this most closely. She wasn't just a caretaker, she was the keeper of his memories. Every small conversation, every fragment of a story became precious. To her, it was heartbreaking to see the man who had once seemed larger than life now caught in the fragility of age. But at the same time, there was something unshakable in him. The wit was still there. The intensity still flashed in his eyes. He refused to let Parkinson's define him, even as it became impossible to ignore. It was in those quiet, fading days that the world seemed to hold its breath. Robert Redford, the man who had challenged studios, broken Hollywood molds, and fought for underdogs, was now engaged in a different kind of battle. One he couldn't win with charisma or talent alone. And just when it seemed his story was winding down, Robert did something no one expected. He revealed a final wish, not to fade away quietly, but to go out with one last act of defiance, a demand that would shake his family and especially Amy to the core. Because Robert Redford wasn't asking for peace, he was asking for fire. It happened in a moment so quiet, so ordinary, that no one in the room expected history to change. The family had gathered around Robert, their conversations hushed, the air heavy with the unspoken truth that his time was slipping away. He sat back in his favorite chair, frail but still carrying that unmistakable presence. And then, with a voice barely above a whisper, he made a request that stunned everyone. "Promise me," he said, turning to Sharon with a fire still flickering in his eyes. "Promise me they'll remember the fire, not the flicker." Those words landed like a lightning bolt. To some, they sounded like poetry. To others, like a challenge. But for Robert, Robert, they were something more. They were a declaration. He wasn't asking to be remembered as a man fading into illness. He wanted to be remembered for the passion, the strength, the rebellion that had fueled his entire life. He wasn't content with quiet goodbyes or fading gently into the night. He wanted one last moment, not as a patient in decline, but as Robert Redford, the legend, a man who had defined his career by doing what others said couldn't be done. And then came the shocker. He didn't just want people to remember the fire. He wanted to show it to them one last time, one final performance. A farewell not whispered in the shadows, but delivered with the same intensity that had once lit up the world. Amy Redford, sitting nearby, felt the full weight of her father's words. This wasn't just a casual wish. This was a demand from a man who had lived his entire life on his own terms. For her, the meaning was crystal clear. He wasn't asking to survive longer, he was asking to be remembered rightly. But how could that happen? His health was fragile, his body was failing. Doctors warned that any attempt to push him into the spotlight again could accelerate the inevitable. The risks were massive, the obstacles endless. And yet, Amy knew immediately she couldn't ignore it. She had to make it happen. Because when a legend like Robert Redford makes his final wish known, you don't question it. You fight for it. From the moment her father spoke those words, Amy's role shifted. She wasn't just his daughter anymore. She became the guardian of his legacy, the one person who would carry his final request forward no matter how impossible it seemed. The challenges were immediate. Doctors warned that the stress of performing could harm him. Friends and family expressed doubts, begging her not to risk his health for something symbolic. Even industry insiders who admired Robert were skeptical. Could a man in his condition truly pull off one last performance without it being heartbreaking to watch? But Amy had grown up in the shadow of her father's resilience. She had seen him rise after career setbacks, reinvent himself when critics counted him out, and fight personal battles no one knew about. She understood that his life had never been about playing it safe. It had always been about defiance, about doing what others believed was impossible. So she pressed forward. She began reaching out quietly to the people who had been closest to Robert throughout his career. Old collaborators, musicians, crew members, trusted friends who had been part of his journey from the beginning. One by one, they answered the call, understanding that this wasn't just another gig. This was history. Meanwhile, Amy navigated a storm of logistics, securing medical supervision, crafting a plan to minimize the risks, convincing skeptical family members that this wasn't about spectacle, but about dignity. And most of all, carrying the emotional burden of knowing that if this went wrong, she would forever bear the weight of having pushed her father too far. But Amy never wavered. Every sleepless night, every difficult conversation, every tear shed in private was fueled by one thought. This is what he wants. Her mission wasn't about making the world happy. It was about giving Robert the ending he deserved. In those weeks, the impossible slowly began to look possible. Plans took shape. The pieces started to align. And Amy realized something profound. This wasn't just about fulfilling a father's wish. It was about rewriting the way people remembered him. Not as a man silenced by illness, but as a fire that refused to go out. And soon, that fire was about to roar one last time. The day finally came. After weeks of planning, of sleepless nights and whispered conversations, everything was set in motion. The stage was ready, the musicians reunited, and the air around the venue seemed to hum with anticipation. Very few people outside the inner circle even knew this was happening. It wasn't about publicity or headlines. It was about something sacred, a final act of defiance against time itself. Backstage, Robert sat quietly, his body frail, but his eyes still fierce. For a moment, Amy questioned whether she had done the right thing. Doctors had warned her repeatedly the strain could be too much. But when she looked at her father, she saw none of that fear. Instead, she saw determination. The same determination that had carried him through decades of battles, both on and off screen. When he was wheeled out before the crowd, the reaction was electric. The audience erupted, not in pity, but in awe. They weren't looking at a man defeated by illness. They were looking at Robert Redford, the same figure who had once defined an era, now returning for one last bow. The cheers rolled like thunder, washing over him as he sat beneath the spotlight. And then he began. His voice was cracked, weathered by age, but the passion in every word carried across the room. Every note, every line was a reminder of who he had been and who he still was. The frailty of his body couldn't erase the fire that lived inside him. For Amy, standing just off stage, it was overwhelming. She watched her father, once untouchable, pour the last of his strength into this moment. It was painful, yes, but it was also beautiful. Because in that instant, he was everything he wanted to be. Not a man fading into the background, but a legend demanding to be seen one final time. The performance didn't last long. It couldn't, but it didn't need to. When it ended, the silence that followed was just as powerful as the applause. Everyone in the room knew they had witnessed something unrepeatable. Not just a farewell, but a declaration. Robert Redford would not be remembered for the flicker. He would be remembered for the fire. The performance was over, but its impact reverberated far beyond that night. For his family, for the friends who stood by him, and for the fans who would later hear the story, it became more than just a final show. It was a reminder of the essence of Robert Redford: resilience, reinvention, and refusal to fade quietly. His career had already secured him a place in history. The films, Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, The Sting, All the President's Men, had defined decades of cinema. His directing had proven he wasn't confined to one role, and the Sundance Institute had transformed the landscape of independent film forever. Generations of filmmakers owed their first break to him, their voices amplified because he dared to create a platform where none existed. But the legacy wasn't just about Hollywood. Robert was also a fierce advocate for the environment. Long before it was popular or profitable to be one, he poured his influence into causes that mattered, standing up when silence would have been easier. That combination, artistry, activism, and authenticity, is what set him apart. Still, for Amy and his family, the true legacy wasn't in awards or movements. It was in the man behind the spotlight, the father who made mistakes but loved fiercely, the storyteller who passed down lessons not just through his films but through late-night conversations, quiet advice, and the example of always pushing forward, no matter the odds. That final performance wasn't just his goodbye, it was his gift, a reminder that no illness, no decline, no passage of time could erase the fire of a life lived boldly. It gave his children a story to hold on to, and it gave the world one last glimpse of the man who had shaped culture and challenged convention. Robert Redford's name was already written into the history books, but that night ensured he wouldn't just be remembered as a legend of the past. He would be remembered as a force who burned brightly until the very end. And for Amy, watching her father leave this world on his own terms, that was the most powerful legacy of all. After the performance, Robert returned to his family home in Utah, the same place where he had spent so many of his quietest, most personal moments. The spotlight had dimmed, but for Amy and the rest of his children, the fire of that night lingered. It wasn't just about the applause or the spectacle. It was about knowing that he had gone out the way he wanted, on his own terms. For all his fame, Robert Redford had always been a complex figure. To Hollywood, he was untouchable. To his fans, he was an icon. But to his family, he was simply Dad, a man who could be stubborn, even flawed, but also deeply loving and fiercely protective of the people closest to him. Amy carried the weight of that duality. She had seen her father transform from Hollywood golden boy to industry titan, and finally into a quiet, reflective man battling illness. She had also seen him laugh, cry, argue, and sacrifice in ways the public would never know. His legacy to her wasn't about the awards that sat on the shelf or the endless articles written about his career. It was about the lessons he left behind. Lessons about resilience, about taking risks, and about never letting the world decide who you should be. The rest of the Redford family, Jack, Kelly, and of course Sharon, all had their own memories and private reflections. But Amy was the one who had carried the burden of his final wish. And when it was over, when Robert finally passed, she realized that the gift she had given him wasn't just a performance. It was dignity. It was closure. It was the chance for a man who had spent his life challenging conventions to do the same in his final moments. For the fans who adored him, the story of Robert Redford's final performance became more than just a touching farewell. It became a symbol, a reminder that even the greatest among us are human, fragile, vulnerable, mortal. And yet, even in those final chapters, there is power in choosing how you'll be remembered. Robert didn't choose silence. He chose fire. When the news of Robert Redford's passing spread, tributes poured in from around the world. Fellow actors, directors, activists, almost ordinary fans all shared what he had meant to them. For many, it was his films. For others, his activism. For still others, it was simply the fact that he had dared to create opportunities for new voices when Hollywood refused to listen. But for Amy and the rest of his family, the tributes that mattered most weren't written in headlines. They were found in quiet stories, in the personal memories people shared about how Robert had touched their lives, often in ways he never even knew. That was his real legacy, not just changing Hollywood, but changing people. In the end, Robert Redford left this world the way he lived in it, unapologetically, passionately, and on his own terms. He showed us that legacy isn't just about what you build in public. It's about the fire you carry privately, the impact you leave on the people closest to you, and the courage to keep fighting even when the odds are stacked against you. Amy continues to carry that torch, ensuring her father's story is remembered not just for the roles he played or the films he directed, but for the man he was at his core, a fighter, a visionary, and a father who refused to let illness define his final chapter. And maybe that's the lesson for all of us. Because if even Robert Redford, a man who seemed larger than life, worried about how he'd be remembered, then what about the rest of us? What kind of fire will you leave behind when your story is told? Let us know in the comments below. Share your thoughts, your memories, or the legacy you want to create. And if this story moved you, share it with someone who admired Robert Redford. His impact wasn't just in Hollywood. It was in the lives he touched, the chances he gave, and the fire that still burns in everyone who carries his story forward. Robert Redford is gone, but his fire, that will never fade.